A cocky border cop mocks a Latino man, but freezes in terror when the man flashes his badge and unleashes justice that shakes the entire station. The desert sun was merciless that afternoon. Heat waves shimmered above the asphalt as cars inched forward at the Laredo border crossing, where dozens of people waited for inspection. The line stretched endlessly, a familiar ritual for those who lived along the US-Mexico border. Families fanned themselves with documents, drivers tapped their steering wheels impatiently, and children asked again and again, "How much longer, Mama?" Among the line of vehicles, a black SUV pulled up slowly. Inside sat a man in his late 30s. His skin bore the bronze of long days under the sun, his dark hair neatly cut, his posture calm, yet commanding. To anyone else, he looked like an ordinary Latino traveling across the border, someone accustomed to the long waits and occasional suspicion from Border Patrol. But there was something about him, something steady and self-assured, that set him apart from the rest. His name was Daniel Reyes. To the public eye, he could pass as a businessman, maybe a teacher, or a family man. Few would guess the truth. Daniel was a high-ranking federal agent, tasked with overseeing sensitive cross-border operations between multiple U.S. agencies. Today, however, he was traveling off-duty, dressed simply in jeans and a collared shirt. His badge, tucked safely inside his leather wallet, remained hidden in his jacket pocket. The SUV rolled forward until it reached inspection lane 3. A Border Patrol officer stood waiting, sunglasses reflecting the sun, boots planted firmly on the cracked pavement. His name was Officer Bradley Henson, a man whose reputation at the border was as hot as the desert itself. Known for his quick temper and arrogance, Bradley carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed the checkpoint belonged to him. As Daniel rolled down his window, Bradley approached with an exaggerated smirk. Well, what do we have here? Another one heading north, huh?" He glanced at Daniel's license plate and then at his face. "Papers, let's see what you got." Daniel calmly handed over his documents. His expression didn't waver, even as Bradley gave him a slow once-over, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You folks always got a story, don't you?" Bradley muttered, flipping through the passport and ID as though expecting to find something wrong. "Visiting family? Looking for work, or just trying to slip through? What is it this time?" Daniel's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but he didn't rise to the bait. "Just heading across for personal matters," he replied evenly, his voice measured. Bradley leaned down, peering into the SUV as if searching for contraband. "Personal matters," he repeated mockingly. "That what you all call it nowadays? You know, I've been doing this job for 15 years and I can spot a liar from a mile away." He paused, waiting for some flicker of fear in Daniel's eyes. But Daniel remained calm, almost detached, his hands resting firmly on the steering wheel. "Then I guess you already know the truth," he said. Bradley didn't like that answer. His smirk hardened into a sneer. "Smart mouth, huh? You people always think you're clever." He tossed the documents onto the dashboard carelessly, leaning closer. "Let me give you a piece of advice. When you come through my lane, you keep your head down and your mouth shut. Got it?" The line of cars behind began to honk faintly. Heat pressed down on everyone, and the tension thickened. Daniel inhaled slowly, resisting the urge to respond. He had dealt with arrogant officers before, but something about Bradley's tone stirred a flicker of anger deep inside him. Still, he kept his composure. Bradley straightened up, raising his hand as if to motion Daniel to pull over for secondary inspection. But before he could speak, a voice crackled over his radio. "Unit 3, hurry it up. We're backed up past the bridge." Bradley's jaw clenched. He looked back at Daniel, annoyance flashing across his face. Then, almost as if to reassert his dominance, he leaned down once more. "You know what? Let's make this interesting," he said with a cold grin. "Step out of the vehicle. Let's have ourselves a little chat." The order was unnecessary. Daniel's documents were in perfect order, and there was no legal reason to detain him. But Bradley's voice left no room for debate. Daniel knew he could argue, but that would only escalate the situation. Calmly, he opened the door and stepped out. The air hit him like a furnace, but his expression stayed unreadable. He stood tall, meeting Bradley's eyes without flinching. The officer circled him slowly, like a wolf sizing up its prey. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" Bradley said quietly, just loud enough for Daniel to hear. "You come through here, with your nice car, your calm little act. But I know your type. I know what's really going on." Daniel finally spoke, his tone even but edged with quiet authority. "What's really going on is that you're wasting both of our time. If you're finished, I'd like to be on my way." The words hit Bradley harder than expected. For a moment, his arrogance faltered. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that, especially not by someone he had already decided was beneath him. His nostrils flared, his hand hovering near his belt, as though daring Daniel to push further. And then, in one careless move, Bradley shoved Daniel lightly against the SUV, as if to remind him who held the power here. The motion wasn't violent, enough to cause injury, but it was humiliating, an assertion of dominance. The line of cars went silent. A few passengers craned their necks to watch, their faces tense. Daniel's eyes darkened, and for the first time, his restraint wavered. In one smooth, deliberate motion, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. With a flick of his wrist, he opened it, revealing a gleaming federal badge shining in the harsh sunlight. The world seemed to freeze. Bradley's smirk vanished instantly, his breath catching in his throat. His eyes locked on the badge, the symbol of authority that outranked his own. His posture stiffened and the color drained from his face. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words carried the weight of quiet power. "You just made a very big mistake." The metallic glint of the badge in Daniel's hand was small but undeniable. It gleamed under the scorching border sun, a silent thunderclap that shifted the air in an instant. The chatter from the surrounding cars died away, and even the hum of engines seemed muted, as though the world itself had stopped to witness what just happened. Officer Bradley Henson's cocky expression evaporated. The arrogant tilt of his head collapsed into stunned disbelief. He took half a step back, his boots scraping the asphalt, eyes fixed on the unmistakable symbol of federal authority. Daniel held the badge steady, not in a boastful manner, but with the gravity of someone who knew its weight. His voice was steady, deliberate, almost quiet. "Special Agent Daniel Reyes, Department of Homeland Security." The words landed like a sledgehammer. Bradley blinked rapidly, his jaw twitching. He had mocked countless people at this checkpoint, used sarcasm and intimidation as his weapon of choice, but never, not once, had he been faced with someone who outranked him, someone who had the power to end his career with a single phone call. "Sir, I didn't," Bradley stammered, his voice cracking under the pressure of his own panic. His hands twitched nervously near his belt, not in aggression anymore, but in helpless uncertainty. Daniel's gaze was unwavering. "Didn't what? Didn't know who I was? Or didn't care who you were humiliating?" A bead of sweat trickled down Bradley's temple, though the sun wasn't the only reason he was sweating now. He opened his mouth to speak but found no words. His confidence, his entire persona of dominance, crumbled before the federal badge. Behind them, the line of cars grew restless again, but no one dared to honk now. Families sat frozen, watching the scene unfold like a movie. Some passengers whispered in hushed Spanish, others in English. They all knew they were witnessing something unusual, something that rarely happened at the border. Daniel finally lowered the badge but did not put it away. He stepped closer, his presence commanding. "You shoved me against my vehicle in front of witnesses. You mocked me because of how I look. Tell me, Officer Henson, is this how you treat everyone who comes through your lane?" Bradley swallowed hard. No, sir, I didn't mean..." "Didn't mean what?" Daniel pressed, his voice sharp now. "Didn't mean to abuse your authority? Didn't mean to disrespect someone because you thought they were powerless?" The officer's lips trembled as he tried to form a defense, but Daniel didn't let him off the hook. "I've been observing cases like this for years," Daniel continued. "Officers who let arrogance override their duty, who forget that wearing a uniform doesn't make you superior, It makes you accountable. His voice carried like a verdict being read in a courtroom, and Bradley felt each word like a gavel striking down. At that moment, a second Border Patrol officer jogged over, alerted by the stalled lane. "Henson, what's going on here? Why's traffic at a standstill?" The newcomer's nameplate read M. Lopez, a younger officer with sharp eyes that immediately caught the glint of Daniel's badge. Lopez's demeanor shifted instantly. He straightened, saluted lightly, and addressed Daniel with respect. "Agent Reyes, sir." His tone carried recognition, even deference. "Is there an issue?" Daniel's expression didn't soften. He nodded toward Bradley, who now looked like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "Your colleague here thought it appropriate to detain and mock me without cause. He also felt entitled to put his hands on me." Lopez's face hardened as he glanced at Bradley. "Is this true?" Bradley's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I didn't know who he was," he muttered weakly, his voice barely audible. "That's not the point," Lopez snapped. He turned back to Daniel, his tone respectful once again. "Sir, I sincerely apologize for this incident. This is not reflective of how we're supposed to conduct ourselves here." Daniel studied him carefully, then nodded. "I know there are good officers, but I also know there are those who abuse the badge. This," he motioned toward Bradley, "is exactly why communities lose trust." The word stung worse than any formal reprimand. Bradley lowered his head, shame flooding his face. He had built his entire identity around being untouchable. At this checkpoint, the man who set the rules. Now, exposed before his peers and civilians, he felt stripped bare. Daniel tucked the badge back into his wallet but kept his eyes locked on Bradley. "You're lucky, Officer Henson, because today I'm off duty. If I weren't, this would already be documented and on the desk of your commanding officer." Bradley's lips parted as though to beg for leniency, but no sound came out. Daniel leaned in slightly, his tone low but cutting. "Remember this moment the next time you feel the urge to mock someone because of their last name, their skin, or their accent. Because one day the person you underestimate might be the one writing your future." The silence that followed was heavier than the desert heat. Even the idling engines seemed subdued, as though the cars themselves were holding their breath. Finally, Daniel stepped back toward his SUV. He opened the door with calm precision, slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. He gave Lopez a respectful nod. "Thank you for stepping in." Lopez nodded back. "Safe travels, sir." Bradley stood frozen, his face pale and his body rigid, as Daniel's SUV pulled forward and disappeared into the flow of traffic. He could still feel the weight of those final words pressing down on him like chains. For the first time in his career, he realized just how fragile his authority was, and how close he had come to losing everything. But Daniel wasn't done. He might have driven off, but his mind was already turning, calculating. This wasn't just about one arrogant officer. It was about a system that allowed men like Bradley to thrive unchecked. And Daniel Reyes wasn't the kind of man to let things slide. The real consequences had only just begun. Bradley Henson sat alone in the break room, the cheap fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting everything in a pale, sickly glow. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped a paper cup of coffee he hadn't touched. Hours had passed since the incident at the checkpoint, but the scene kept replaying in his mind. The flash of the badge, the cutting authority in Daniel's voice, and the suffocating realization that he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Normally, after a shift, Bradley would brag about how he put someone in their place. He thrived on telling war stories of how he made nervous travelers sweat, of how he sniffed out liars and reminded people who was in charge. His colleagues would chuckle or roll their eyes, but no one ever challenged him outright. Bradley had always been loud, arrogant, but seemingly untouchable. Not tonight. When he had returned to the station, silence had followed him. The younger officer, Lopez, had clearly spread word of what happened, and whispers circulated through the hallways like wildfire. Bradley could feel the shift. Where once he was the loudest presence in the room, now every glance seemed to carry judgment. The door opened suddenly, and his commanding officer, Captain Rivera, stepped inside. Rivera was a man in his 50s, tall, lean, with eyes that could cut through excuses like a knife through paper. He held a folder in his hand, and his jaw was set in that dangerous way Bradley recognized all too well. Anger contained just enough to remain professional. "Officer Henson," Rivera said flatly. "My office. Now." Bradley's stomach dropped. He stood quickly, nearly knocking over the untouched coffee. His boots echoed heavily against the tile floor as he followed Rivera down the narrow hallway. The walls seemed to close in around him. Inside the captain's office, the blinds were drawn, the air conditioning humming steadily. Rivera shut the door behind them with a firm click before sitting down at his desk. He opened the folder, pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the desk toward Bradley. It was a report form, half completed but unmistakable. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Incident Report, Officer Misconduct." Bradley's throat went dry. "Captain, I can explain." Rivera's hand slammed against the desk, silencing him. "Explain? You shoved a federal agent against his vehicle at a checkpoint in front of civilians. You mocked him, you taunted him, and you thought you could get away with it because you didn't know who he was." Bradley's face flushed crimson. "I didn't know he was a Fed. If I had, that's exactly the problem." Rivera cut in sharply. His eyes burned with fury. "You shouldn't treat anyone that way. Not a citizen, not a traveler, not a migrant, not a federal agent, no one. You've been warned before, Henson. Too many complaints about your mouth, your attitude, the way you escalate situations instead of de-escalating them. And now this? This could cost us more than just your career. It could stain this entire station." Bradley's chest tightened. He had been written up before, yes, but nothing had ever stuck. He always managed to charm or bluff his way out of real consequences. But this time was different. This time the man he mocked had power. Real power. "Captain, please," Bradley said, his voice cracking with desperation. I was just doing my job. The guy looked suspicious. I was trying to enforce the law." Rivera's expression hardened. "Don't insult my intelligence. You weren't enforcing the law. You were enforcing your ego." He leaned forward, his voice low and deadly serious. "Do you know who Agent Daniel Reyes is?" Bradley shook his head slowly. "He's not just some field agent. He's a senior investigator with Homeland Security. He oversees multi-agency operations that you don't even have clearance to hear about. He's connected, deeply connected. If he decides to file a complaint, do you have any idea what that means for you?" "For us?" Bradley's pulse thundered in his ears. He gripped the armrests of his chair, trying to steady himself. "Captain, I'll apologize. I'll make it right. Just don't let him ruin me." Rivera's gaze was unyielding. "You ruined yourself the moment you laid hands on him." The words hit harder than any physical blow. Bradley slumped in his chair, his arrogance drained away. For the first time in years, he felt small, truly small. Rivera stood abruptly. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Turn in your badge and your weapon." Bradley's head snapped up. "Suspended? You're lucky it's not termination," Rivera snapped back. "Frankly, I expect Reyes to follow up with an official complaint. If he does, you won't just lose your badge. You'll be lucky if you're not facing charges." Bradley's stomach churned violently. He thought back to the smugness he felt earlier that day, the satisfaction of putting Daniel in his place. Now, that same memory filled him with shame and terror. Slowly, with trembling hands, he unpinned his badge and unholstered his sidearm, placing them on Rivera's desk. The metallic clink was deafening in the silence of the room. Rivera picked them up and placed them in the drawer. "Get out of my sight, and pray that Agent Reyes decides you're not worth his time." Bradley stood on unsteady legs, his mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came. He turned and walked out of the office, each step feeling like the ground was crumbling beneath him. As he exited the station, the other officers watched silently. No one smirked, no one spoke. The once loud Bradley Henson, reduced to a pale, shaken figure, felt the weight of their stares pressing into him like knives. Outside, the desert evening was settling in. The heat had softened, but the air still felt suffocating. Bradley sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, his mind spinning with panic. He had thought himself untouchable, but Daniel Reyes had shattered that illusion with a single flash of his badge. And deep down, Bradley knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Because men like Daniel Reyes didn't just walk away. They made sure justice was served. Daniel Reyes didn't like making scenes. That wasn't his style. Power, he believed, was most effective when applied quietly, surgically, like a scalpel instead of a hammer. As he drove away from the border checkpoint, his face betrayed nothing. But inside, his mind gears were already turning. The arrogance of Officer Bradley Henson wasn't unique. It was symptomatic. Daniel had seen it too many times before. The smirk of unchecked authority, the mockery of someone assumed powerless, the casual abuse hidden behind a badge. The only difference this time was that Bradley had chosen the wrong man. By nightfall, Daniel was in his hotel room in Laredo, laptop open, fingers gliding across the keyboard with precision. A secure Homeland Security database flickered on the screen. With his clearance, he didn't need to wait for reports or second-hand accounts. He could dig directly into records. He typed, Henson, Bradley, Border Patrol. The file appeared instantly, a digital dossier full of service history, commendations, and, most tellingly, complaints. Daniel scrolled slowly, his eyes narrowing. There they were. Caution 17. Complaint filed by a Mexican-American family alleging verbal harassment at the checkpoint. 19. A commercial truck driver accused Henson of rough handling during inspection. 2021. Internal review flagged multiple use of force incidents, all dismissed for lack of evidence. 2023. An anonymous fellow officer reported unprofessional conduct toward both travelers and colleagues. Each complaint had been swept aside. No disciplinary action taken, no accountability. Daniel leaned back, exhaling through his nose. A pattern, clear as day. Bradley wasn't just a bad apple. He was a festering rot protected by the silence of others. He drafted a short, encrypted email to a contact at DHS Internal Affairs. The subject line was blunt. Pattern of misconduct. Border Patrol officer. Henson. Attached were the flagged incidents along with a brief note. Recommend review of recent conduct witnessed firsthand. Daniel didn't press send yet. Timing was everything. Instead, he began another search, this time through the station's collective disciplinary record. If Bradley's behavior had gone unchecked, chances were others at that post were skating by too. His hunch was right. More red flags appeared. Reports of missing contraband during inspections, patterns of detaining certain ethnic groups longer than others, even whispers of bribes from truck drivers trying to skip long inspections. Daniel's jaw tightened. The checkpoint wasn't just a workplace of arrogance, it was a powder keg of corruption, waiting for the right spark. Meanwhile, at the border station, Bradley's world was crumbling. He sat at home in his dimly lit living room, a bottle of whiskey on the table. His suspension papers lay folded beside him, the ink still fresh. His wife had tried to console him earlier, but he snapped at her, his frustration boiling over. Now, she'd gone upstairs, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He replayed the scene over and over, the badge, the look in Daniel's eyes, the shame he felt in front of Lopez. The silence in the station afterward was the worst of all. For the first time in his career, Bradley had no defenders, no backup, and then the paranoia began. What if Agent Reyes had already filed a report? What if DHS was building a case against him? He had cut corners before, done things that wouldn't look good under scrutiny. He told himself it was just part of the job, that everyone bent the rules. But in the hands of someone like Reyes, every minor misstep could be twisted into something career-ending. Bradley poured another drink, his hand shaking. Damn him, he muttered to the empty room. Damn him for thinking he's better than me. But deep down, beneath the anger, there was fear. Because he knew He was better than me. The next morning, Daniel walked into a federal office building in downtown Laredo. The air conditioning blasted cold against the rising desert heat. The lobby filled with the quiet bustle of clerks and agents. He checked in with security, flashing his badge with calm authority, and rode the elevator to the 5th floor. Waiting for him was Agent Carter, a longtime colleague in internal affairs. Carter was tall, wiry, with sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. "You look like a man who's about to drop a grenade in my lap," Carter said dryly as Daniel entered his office. Daniel smirked faintly. Not a grenade, more like a slow-burning fuse. He handed Carter a USB drive. "Bradley Henson, Border Patrol. I had a run-in with him yesterday. He shoved me against my car, mocked me in front of civilians. I flashed the badge and he froze. But that's just surface level. His file's a mess, complaints buried, misconduct ignored, and he's not the only one at that station." Carter plugged the drive into his laptop, scanning through the documents. His brow furrowed. "Damn, you weren't kidding." Daniel's tone was measured. "This isn't about bruised pride. It's about culture. Men like Henson get away with it because no one checks them. That station is rotting from the inside. I want it cleaned up." Carter leaned back, folding his hands. "You realize if we pursue this, it won't just be Henson. We'll be pulling threads that could unravel the whole post. Commanders, supervisors, maybe even the regional office." Daniel's eyes hardened. "Good. That's exactly the point." For a moment, silence hung in the room. Then Carter nodded. "All right. I'll initiate a preliminary investigation. Quietly for now. If Reyes is saying this stinks, I trust it stinks." Daniel stood. "I don't want this swept under the rug, Carter. I want accountability. If we let men like Henson keep that badge, we all lose credibility." Carter's lips curved into the faintest smile. "You've always had a taste for justice, Reyes. Fine. Let's shake the tree and see what falls." That night, as Bradley sat hunched in his living room, his phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "We need to talk. Internal Affairs is asking questions. L." Bradley's blood ran cold. L could only mean one person, Officer Lopez. For a moment, relief washed over him. Maybe Lopez was warning him. Maybe he still had an ally. But as the whiskey fog cleared from his brain, a darker thought crept in. What if Lopez wasn't warning him at all? What if Lopez had already flipped, already talking to Internal Affairs, already helping Reyes build the case? Bradley stared at the message, his hands clammy, his pulse racing. For the first time, he realized the truth. The walls weren't just closing in, they were already touching his shoulders. The morning sun crept over the border station, casting long shadows across the checkpoint. For most officers, it was just another day of traffic, paperwork, and weary travelers. But for Officer Bradley Henson, the walls of his world were crumbling faster than he could rebuild them. He hadn't slept. His phone buzzed endlessly through the night. Texts from Lopez, whispers from colleagues, even a call from his union rep telling him to keep his mouth shut and lawyer up. The air was heavy with tension, and Bradley could feel it every time he walked past the station's glass doors. Eyes followed him. Conversation stopped when he entered the room. By noon, his worst fears were confirmed. 2 black SUVs rolled into the parking lot, sleek and unmarked, the kind that carried weight. From them stepped Agent Carter and 2 other men in suits, their expressions hard, their presence unmistakable. Internal Affairs had arrived. Bradley stood frozen near the lockers as they passed by, his throat dry, his palms sweaty. Carter's eyes flicked to him briefly, sharp, cold, dismissive, and that single glance was enough to drain the blood from his face. The suits headed straight for Captain Rivera's office. The door closed behind them, but Bradley didn't need to hear the words to know what was happening. This was no routine check. This was the beginning of the end. Inside the office, Carter spread out a thick folder on Rivera's desk. "We've reviewed Reyes' report. We also cross-checked your station's disciplinary history. There are too many coincidences, too many complaints dismissed without proper investigation. This isn't just about Henson anymore. It's about systemic misconduct, Rivera's jaw clenched. He had always known the culture at the station leaned too far toward cowboy tactics, but he hadn't expected it to blow up like this. "What happens next?" he asked grimly. Carter leaned forward. "We'll be conducting interviews. Quietly at first, but full scale if we need to. We already have sworn statements from civilians about yesterday's incident, and we're pulling camera footage. If what we suspect is true, there's going to be a house cleaning." Rivera exhaled slowly. "And Henson?" Carter's eyes sharpened. "Henson will be the example. He opened this door. Now we're going to walk through it." In the break room, whispers spread like wildfire. Bradley sat at the table pretending to scroll his phone, but every word reached his ears. "They say Reyes is internal affairs guy. Carter's here because of Henson. It's over for him. Good riddance. Guy thought he was king of the checkpoint." Each whisper was a dagger. The room that once echoed with his bravado now suffocated him with silence. Finally, the door opened. Carter stepped in, a clipboard in hand. His eyes swept the room and landed squarely on Bradley. "Officer Henson, my office. Now." The break room went dead quiet. Every officer stared, some with pity, others with thinly veiled satisfaction. Bradley's legs felt like lead as he stood. He followed Carter down the hallway, each step echoing like the tolling of a bell. Inside the interview room, the walls were bare, the lighting harsh. A recorder sat on the table. Carter gestured for him to sit. Bradley lowered himself slowly into the chair, his hands trembling. Carter didn't waste time. "Officer Henson, you are under formal investigation for misconduct. This includes abuse of authority, unprofessional conduct, and excessive use of force. Do you understand?" Bradley's throat tightened. "Yes, sir. But Carter cut him off. "Save it. We have statements from multiple witnesses, civilians, your fellow officers, and thanks to Agent Reyes's report, we've been able to cross-reference your history. Do you want to know what we found?" Bradley swallowed hard. I was just doing my job." Carter's voice was sharp. "Your job is to enforce the law fairly, not to mock travelers, not to shove them against their cars, and certainly not to humiliate a federal agent in front of dozens of people." He leaned in, his voice dropping lower, colder. "You let your ego wear the badge, and now that badge is gone." Bradley's chest constricted. "Please, I've given 15 years to this job. I can do better. Just give me one more chance." Carter's expression was stone. "You had 15 years to do better, and you chose arrogance every time. It ends here." The door opened. Two uniformed officers stepped in, not Border Patrol, but Internal Affairs Enforcement. Bradley's heart sank. Carter spoke calmly, like a judge delivering a sentence. "Officer Bradley Henson, you are relieved of duty effective immediately. Your badge and credentials are revoked. You will face disciplinary hearings and, given the evidence, likely termination. Further, based on your actions yesterday, charges of misconduct are being reviewed for possible federal prosecution." Bradley's world collapsed. He shook his head desperately. No, please, you can't do this. I made a mistake." "But—" The officers stepped forward. "Sir, please stand." His legs buckled as they pulled him to his feet. For the first time in his life, Bradley felt what it was like to be powerless. No smirk, no swagger, no clever remark could save him now. As they escorted him down the hallway, every set of eyes followed him. Once he had been the loudest voice in the room. Now he was nothing but a cautionary tale. Later that evening, Daniel Reyes sat in a quiet cafe downtown. He sipped his coffee calmly, watching the world go by outside the window. His phone buzzed. A message from Carter. "Henson's done, investigation expanding, good call, Reyes." Daniel typed back. It wasn't a call. It was justice. He set the phone down, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He hadn't needed to shout, hadn't needed to make threats. All it took was a badge, a moment of truth, and the strength to follow through. Because in the end, true authority isn't in mocking the powerless, it's in holding the powerful accountable. And Bradley Henson had just learned that the hard way.